There are cities built of stone that stand for 1,000 years, and then there are cities built of lies that can crumble a soul in a single night. Smyrna was a crown of white marble sitting on the edge of the dark Aegean Sea, a place of stunning beauty and terrifying wealth, where the smell of myrrh from the marketplace mingled with the metallic tang of Roman swords. Before we step into the shadowed porticos of this ancient metropolis to witness the clash between the true faithful and the impostors, may the Almighty God protect and bless those who subscribe and like this content for our efforts. It might seem simple to you, but it brings us great joy. Also, please mention in the comments which part of the world you are watching from, what emotion this story gave you, and do you believe it will make us happy to reply to your comments. Now, let us walk the streets of the 1st century, where a group of men claiming to hold the keys to heaven were actually building a doorway to hell. The year was 95 or perhaps 96 in the era of our Lord, though the world bowed the knee to a different Lord. Domitian, the Emperor of Rome, had declared himself a god, demanding to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. In the great city of Smyrna, loyalty was not just a feeling, it was a ritual. Once a year, every citizen was expected to take a pinch of incense, drop it onto the burning coals of the altar before the bust of Caesar, and speak the words that sealed their safety. Caesar is Lord. To refuse was treason. To refuse was death. For the wealthy merchants and the pagan priests it was a meaningless gesture, a tax of conscience paid for the privilege of commerce. But for the followers of the way, the disciples of Jesus the Nazarene, it was an impossibility. They had only one Lord, and he had been crucified under Pontius Pilate, and raised to life by the power of the Spirit. They could not bow. In this pressure cooker of imperial worship, the Jewish community of Smyrna held a privileged position. They were protected by ancient treaties, recognized as a religio licita, a legal religion. Rome allowed the Jews to abstain from the emperor cult because their god was ancient and their traditions were ancestral. As long as they prayed for the emperor, they did not have to pray to him. This exemption was a shield, a wall of safety in a dangerous world. And for decades, the early Christians, who were mostly Jewish converts, huddled behind this shield, viewed by the Romans as merely a sect within Judaism. But as the 1st century drew to a close, the gap between the synagogue and the church had widened into a chasm. The shield was being withdrawn. The leader of the synagogue in Smyrna was a man named Malachi, though many called him by his Greek name Alexander, for he moved as easily among the Roman magistrates as he did among the Torah scrolls. He was a man of imposing stature, with a beard that flowed like white wool, and eyes that possessed the hardness of polished onyx. Malachi believed himself to be the guardian of the heritage of Israel. He saw the Torah as a fortress that had to be defended, not just from the pagan Romans, but from the internal corruption of the Nazarenes. To him, these Christians who claimed a dead carpenter was the Messiah were worse than pagans. They were heretics who threatened the safety of the entire Jewish community. If Rome decided that these troublemakers were Jews, the entire community might suffer. If Rome decided they were not Jews, then the Christians would be exposed to the wrath of the empire. Malachi had made his choice. He would cut off the limb to save the body. On the other side of the city, in the humbler quarter near the tanneries and the docks, lived Polycarp. He was younger than Malachi, a man of gentle spirit but iron conviction. He had learned the faith at the feet of the Apostle John himself, before the old apostle was banished to the prison island of Patmos. Polycarp was the overseer, the bishop of the small beleaguered community of believers in Smyrna. Their meeting place was not a grand building of stone with colonnades and gold leaf. It was the upper room of a merchant's house, smelling of lamp oil and damp wood. They were poor, not because they lacked skill, but because the trade guilds of Smyrna were inextricably linked to pagan idolatry. To work, one had to feast in the pagan temples. The Christians refused, and so they were slowly starved, pushed to the margins of the economy. The tension in the city was palpable, like the static in the air before a thunderstorm. It began with whispers in the marketplace. A Christian shopkeeper would find his stall overturned. A believer walking to the well would be spat upon, not by a Roman soldier, but by a former neighbor from the synagogue. Malachi had begun a campaign of systematic exclusion. He had instituted a new prayer in the synagogue liturgy, a curse upon the heretics, forcing anyone who followed Jesus to remain silent or leave. Most left, but expulsion was not enough for Malachi. He wanted eradication. He wanted to prove to the Roman proconsul that these people were not Jews, that they had no legal protection, and that their refusal to worship Caesar was an act of sedition that had nothing to do with the Jewish faith. One evening, As the sun set over the harbor, turning the water to the color of blood, Malachi sat in his study with two of his associates. The room was lined with scrolls, the wealth of wisdom accumulated over centuries. But the conversation was not about wisdom, it was about politics. "The proconsul is growing impatient," Malachi said, his voice smooth and cold. "He hears rumors of a secret society that eats flesh and drinks blood. He asks me why we tolerate them. I told him we do not." One of the associates, a younger man named Simon, leaned forward. "But if we hand them over, Malachi, we are handing over our own flesh and blood to the Romans. Many of them are cousins, brothers." Malachi slammed his hand on the table. "They are not our brothers. They have forfeited their birthright. They follow a man who was cursed by God, hung on a tree. They endanger the temple of the Torah. If we do not separate ourselves from them, Rome will burn us all. Is it not better that a few perish than the whole nation be suspected of treason?" It was the logic of Caiaphas reborn in Smyrna. It was the reasoning of survival at the cost of the soul. Malachi was crafting a narrative, a lie that would be whispered into the ears of the magistrates. He would say that the Christians were atheists, for they had no idols. He would say they were cannibals, twisting the words of their Eucharist. He would say they were revolutionaries. He claimed to be a Jew, a true son of Abraham, but in his heart he had become an accuser, and in the Hebrew tongue the word for accuser is Satan. By taking on the role of the accuser of the brethren, Malachi and his council were transforming their holy assembly into a synagogue of Satan. Polycarp felt the net tightening. He sat in the upper room with a few anxious elders. The poverty of the church was grinding them down. "We have no grain for the widows this week," one deaconess reported, her eyes red from weeping. "The Guild of Bakers refuses to sell to us unless we pour a libation to Demeter." "We refused," Polycarp nodded, his face etched with sorrow. "We are rich, my sister," he said softly, quoting a truth that was hard to see with human eyes. "We are poor in silver, but we are rich in the kingdom. Do not fear." But fear was a constant companion. They knew what Malachi was doing. They had heard the slander. They knew that their names were being written on lists and handed to the authorities. The betrayal came to a head during the festival of Caesar. The city was adorned with garlands. Processions filled the streets. The smell of roasting meat sacrificed to idols was everywhere. It was a time of drunken revelry for the pagans, but a time of terror for the Christians. Malachi saw this as the perfect opportunity. He went to the proconsul's palace, dressed in his finest robes, presenting himself as a loyal subject of Rome. He brought a gift and he brought a list. "There are those in this city," Malachi told the Roman governor, "who hide amongst us Jews but refuse to honor the emperor. They claim our protection, but they do not share our loyalty. We wash our hands of them. They are yours to do with as you please." With those words, the legal shield was shattered. The hunt began. That night, soldiers banged on the doors of the faithful. They didn't arrest everyone. They wanted to make examples. They dragged a man named Germanicus, a young believer full of fire, into the street. They beat him. They dragged him to the prison. And standing in the shadows, watching the arrest, were members of the synagogue. They weren't weeping for their brother. They were nodding in approval. They believed they were doing God a service. They believed they were purifying the vineyard. They did not see the dark shadow that stood behind them, the spiritual reality of their actions. They were serving the dragon while quoting the Torah. Polycarp spent the night in prayer. He did not know if they would come for him next. He wrestled with God, asking for courage, asking for provision for his flock. He felt the slander of the Jews, those who called themselves Jews but were not. Like a physical weight, it was a confusing pain. To be persecuted by the Romans was expected. The world hates the light, but to be betrayed by those who read the same prophets, who sang the same psalms, who worshiped the same Creator, that was a knife in the back. It raised a terrifying theological question. Who are the true people of God? Is it those who have the bloodline, or those who have the faith of the Messiah? In the midst of this darkness, a small boat slipped into the harbor of Smyrna under the cover of fog. It carried a messenger from the island of Patmos. He was a ragged man, exhausted, his skin burned by the sun and salt. He carried nothing of value, no gold or spices. He carried only a single scroll of parchment wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the spray. He made his way through the back alleys, avoiding the Roman patrols searching for the house of Polycarp. The knock on the door at dawn terrified the believers gathered inside. They thought it was the death squad. Polycarp motioned for silence and went to the door himself. He opened it a crack. The messenger collapsed into his arms. "From John," the man rasped. "From the elder." A revelation, the word revelation, apocalypse, sent a shiver through the room. They laid the messenger down and gave him water. Polycarp took the scroll with trembling hands. It was sealed. He broke the seal. The parchment was filled with the handwriting of his old teacher, the beloved disciple. But the words were not John's own. He had merely acted as the scribe. These were words dictated by a voice like the sound of many waters, words from the one who walks among the golden lampstands. Polycarp gathered the church. They crowded into the room, faces pale, stomachs empty, hearts heavy with the dread of the coming trials. "Brothers and sisters," Polycarp said, his voice gaining strength, "the Lord has not forgotten us. He has seen us. He has sent us a word." He began to read. The scroll contained messages to 7 churches in the province of Asia. He read past Ephesus. He came to the section marked for Smyrna. The room went deathly silent. Every ear was strained. "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life." The opening statement was an anchor. In a city where the emperor claimed to be God, Jesus declared that he was the first and the last. In a city where death was the punishment for faith, Jesus reminded them that he had died and come to life. He had conquered the very thing they feared most. Polycarp continued reading. "I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich." A collective sob broke out in the room. He knew, the master knew. He saw their empty cupboards, he saw their ragged clothes, he saw the social ostracism, and he redefined their reality. The world called them destitute, Jesus called them rich. They possessed the crown of life. Then came the verdict. The words that would define the spiritual battleground for eternity, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. The gasps were audible. Jesus had named their enemy. He had stripped away the mask of religious respectability that Malachi and his council wore. They claimed to be Jews. The word literally means praise or confessors of God. They claimed to be the chosen ones. But Jesus said, they are not. By rejecting the Messiah, the fulfillment of the Torah, and by persecuting his body, they had forfeited their title. They were not an assembly of Yahweh. They had become an assembly of the adversary. They were doing the devil's work of accusation and murder. It was a terrifying designation. It meant that the greatest threat to the church was not the pagan Rome with its visible swords, but the religious deception that operated under the guise of truth. These men were liars. They lied about God, they lied about the Christians, and they lied to themselves. Polycarp read on, his voice ringing with the steel of divine encouragement. "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." The letter did not promise escape. It did not say that Malachi would be struck down by lightning or that the proconsul would be converted. It promised suffering. It promised prison. It promised that the devil himself was behind the attacks. But it also set a limit, 10 days, a specific, bounded period of time. The suffering would not last forever, and the reward was not safety in Smyrna, but a crown of life in the eternal city. The reading of the scroll changed the atmosphere in the room. The fear did not vanish, but it was transformed into fortitude. They now understood the nature of the battle. They weren't just fighting bad neighbors. They were standing on the front lines of a cosmic war between the synagogue of Satan and the Church of Christ. Meanwhile, in the house of Malachi, a celebration was underway. The proconsul had accepted the list. The raids had begun. Malachi raised a cup of wine, believing he had secured the future of his community. He did not know that across the city, his name had been spoken by the Son of God, and his assembly had been branded with a title that would mark them as the ultimate tragedy of religious pride. He thought he was saving Israel. In reality, he was warring against the King of Israel. The conflict in Smyrna was about to turn bloody. The lines were drawn. On one side stood the power of the empire and the religious zeal of the accusers. On the other side stood a group of impoverished believers, armed only with the promise of a resurrection. The synagogue of Satan had played its hand, but the first and the last had not yet made his final move. The test had begun. Polycarp rolled up the scroll. He looked at his flock. "We have our orders," he said quietly. "We do not hate our accusers. We pray for them, but we do not bow to their lies. We are the true circumcision, who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus. Tomorrow we may die, but we will not die as cowards. We will die as kings." As the dawn broke over Smyrna, the sounds of the city waking up mingled with the prayers of the saints. The marble temples of the pagans gleamed white in the sun, beautiful sepulchres full of dead men's bones. But in the hidden places the true life was burning, a fire that no amount of persecution could extinguish. The battle for the soul of the city was underway, and the blood of the martyrs would soon become the seed of the church. But the mystery of the synagogue of Satan would haunt the believers, how those so close to the truth could become its fiercest enemies. It was a lesson in the deceitfulness of the human heart. a warning that religion without Jesus is just another tool of the darkness. The sun rose over the harbor of Smyrna, casting long golden fingers across the water. But to the small community of believers huddled in the tanner's district, the light brought no warmth. It only served to illuminate the precariousness of their existence. The reading of the scroll from Patmos had steeled their spirits, but it had not stopped the machinery of destruction that Malachi and his council had set in motion. The 10 days of tribulation that the Lord had prophesied were not merely a metaphor for a brief time. They were a literal season of intense, concentrated pressure, a siege laid against the soul of the church. The first of these days began with a silence that was more terrifying than the shouting of the mob. It was the silence of exclusion, the cold shoulder of a city that had decided the Christians were a contagion to be purged. Malachi sat in the central court of the synagogue, the seat of Moses, smoothing the parchment of the Torah scroll with a hand that did not tremble. He felt a profound sense of righteousness. To his mind, he was Phinehas, the zealot who had driven a spear through the Israelite man and the Midianite woman to stop the plague. The plague today was the heresy of the Nazarene, and the spear he was wielding was the legal authority of Rome. He had provided the proconsul, Statius Quadratus, with a detailed list of names. These were not just random accusations. They were carefully curated. Malachi knew who the leaders were. He knew where they lived. He knew which shopkeepers were funding the church's charity. He had watched them for years, noting their refusal to work on the Lord's day, their secret gatherings, their rejection of the synagogue's authority. Now he was calling in the debt. The first blow struck the economic heart of the community. In the bustling agora of Smyrna, where the trade guilds held sway, the lines were drawn. A Christian silversmith named Demetrius arrived at his stall to find it smashed, his tools scattered in the dust. When he went to the guildmaster to complain, he was met not with justice, but with a sneer. The guildmaster, a man who grew rich selling idols to the tourists, held up a small pinch of incense. He pointed to the altar of the emperor that stood at the entrance of the market. "Burn this," the master said, "and you can sell. Refuse, and you are no longer a citizen of this market." Demetrius looked at the altar, then at his ruined stall, and walked away. He went home to a wife and children who would not eat that night. Across the city, the scene was repeated. Bakers refused to sell bread to women known to be believers. Water carriers bypassed Christian homes. It was a siege of starvation, orchestrated by the whispers of the synagogue that had poisoned the minds of the pagans against their neighbors. But hunger was a slow weapon, and Malachi was impatient. He wanted to see the heresy uprooted before the great festival of Caesar, which was approaching. He went to the magistrates again, this time with a darker accusation. He told them that the Christians were not merely stubborn, they were dangerous. He spun tales of their secret love feasts, twisting the Holy Communion into a narrative of cannibalism and incest. He claimed their refusal to bow to Caesar was not religious scruple but political rebellion. "They are waiting for their own king to return," Malachi whispered, "a king who will smash the nations with a rod of iron. Do you want such a fifth column in your city, acting under your nose?" The magistrates, fearing a report of sedition reaching Rome, signed the warrants. The arrests began on the third day. The Roman soldiers, guided by young men from the synagogue who acted as informants, moved through the city like a scythe. They did not come in the daylight. They came at night, kicking down doors, dragging fathers from their beds, pulling mothers away from screaming infants. The prisons of Smyrna were not built for comfort. They were holding cells, damp, rat-infested holes carved into the rock beneath the government buildings. There, the believers were thrown together, packed so tightly they could barely sit. The darkness was absolute, the stench overpowering. But in that darkness a strange sound began to rise. It was not weeping, it was singing. They sang the Psalms of David. They sang the hymns of the faith. "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain." The guards, used to the screams of criminals, were unnerved. Polycarp remained free, not because he hid, but because the proconsul was hesitant to arrest such a prominent figure without a specific provocation. Polycarp was an old man, respected even by many pagans for his charity. To arrest him would stir the city. So the authorities started with the young, the weak, the recent converts, hoping to break them and force them to implicate their bishop. Among those arrested was a youth named Germanicus. He was barely out of boyhood, full of the fiery zeal that often marks the new believer. He was thrown into the dungeon with the others, his face bruised from the rough handling of the soldiers. In the synagogue, the mood was triumphant. Malachi preached a sermon on the purity of the camp. He spoke of the necessity of cutting off the gangrenous limb. He did not tell his congregation that he was sending men to their deaths. He told them he was sending traitors to justice. The deception was total. They believed they were the defenders of God, while in reality they were fueling the fires of Moloch. The synagogue of Satan was not a building. It was this collective delusion, this inversion of truth where murder became holiness and hatred became zeal. They were the accusers, standing at the right hand of the Romans to resist the righteous. The fifth day brought the beginning of the trials. The proconsul sat on the tribunal seat in the great forum. The prisoners were brought out, blinking in the harsh sunlight, their clothes torn, their bodies weak from hunger. The crowd gathered. The people of Smyrna loved a spectacle, and the trial of the atheists, as the Christians were called because they rejected the pagan gods, was the best entertainment in town. Malachi and the elders of the synagogue stood in the front row, not as defendants, but as expert witnesses. When a Christian tried to speak to defend their faith using the prophets, the Jews would shout them down, tearing their clothes and crying blasphemy. They drowned out the truth with noise, a tactic of the adversary since the beginning of time. One by one, the believers were given the choice. A small altar was placed before the judgment seat. A bust of Caesar stared blankly at them. A soldier held a box of incense. "Just a pinch," the proconsul would say, bored by the proceedings. "Just say Caesar is Lord and go home." It was such a small thing, a flick of the wrist, a meaningless phrase. But the men and women standing there saw the invisible reality. They saw the cloud of witnesses. They saw the nail-scarred hands of the true Lord. To say Caesar is Lord was to say Jesus is not. It was to unmake their salvation. And so, with trembling voices, they refused. "I am a Christian," they would say. It was a death sentence. As the days of the tribulation wore on, the violence escalated. The proconsul, frustrated by their obstinacy and goaded by the Jewish leaders, ordered the arena to be prepared. The beast fighters, the bestiary were summoned. The lions and leopards, kept hungry in the pits beneath the stadium, roared in anticipation. The games were set for the Sabbath. A deliberate insult, or perhaps a calculated move by Malachi to show that he valued the destruction of the heretics more than the rest of the holy day. The Sabbath dawned bright and cold. The great stadium of Smyrna, carved into the hillside, filled with thousands of spectators, Romans, Greeks, slaves, freemen. They all poured in, hungry for blood, and there, sitting in the reserved seats, were the prominent members of the synagogue. They had walked past the commandment to keep the day holy in order to witness the execution of the saints. They justified it as witnessing the judgment of God. They did not see that they had become the very thing they despised, spectators at a pagan blood ritual. Germanicus was the first to be dragged into the sand. The young man stood alone in the center of the vast arena. The noise of the crowd was like a physical blow, a wall of hatred hitting him from all sides. The proconsul looked down at him from the imperial box. He felt a twinge of pity. The boy was handsome, strong, with his whole life ahead of him. "Have pity on your youth," the proconsul called out. "Recant. Swear by the genius of Caesar. Why throw your life away for a fable?" Germanicus looked up. He saw the proconsul. He saw the mob. He saw the Jewish elders nodding in agreement with the Roman governor. And then he looked beyond them. He saw the open sky. He remembered the words of the letter. "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." He knew that any hesitation now would be a victory for the darkness. He did not want to be saved. He wanted to be faithful. The gate clanged open. A lion, massive and starving, bounded into the arena. It stopped, blinking in the light, its tail twitching. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the chase. But Germanicus did not run. He did not cower. To the astonishment of the proconsul and the horror of the crowd, the young man ran toward the beast. He provoked it, waving his arms, shouting for it to come. He wanted to end the temptation. He wanted to cross the threshold before his courage failed. The lion murmured and sprang. The violence was quick. The dust of the arena turned red. But the death of Germanicus did not satisfy the mob. It inflamed them. The sight of such supernatural courage, such disregard for death, was terrifying to people who lived in fear of the grave. They felt judged by his death. The silence that followed the kill was broken by a single voice from the crowd, perhaps a plant by the synagogue, or perhaps a spontaneous eruption of collective hatred. "Away with the atheists," the voice screamed, then another joined in. "Fetch Polycarp," the name spread like wildfire. "Polycarp, Polycarp, let us find the father of the Christians, let us burn the root," Malachi smiled. This was what he had been waiting for. The mob had done his work. He did not need to arrest the bishop himself. The people were demanding it. The Roman authorities would have no choice but to act to prevent a riot. The hunt for the old man was on. Polycarp was not in the city. The believers, sensing the rising tide of danger, had persuaded him to withdraw to a small farm in the country a few miles outside the walls. He had gone reluctantly, only to preserve the peace of the church. There he spent his days and nights in prayer. interceding for all the churches and for the world that was trying to kill him. 3 days before he was taken, while he was praying at night, he fell into a trance. He saw his pillow consumed by fire. He watched it burn until it was nothing but ash. He woke up and turned to his companions. He spoke with the calm certainty of a prophet. "I must be burned alive." The soldiers, led by a police captain who ironically bore the name Herod, were frantic to find him. The mob was getting restless. They searched the city but found nothing. Finally, on a Friday evening, the preparation day for the Christians and the Sabbath eve for the Jews, they found a servant boy from Polycarp's household. He was carrying a basket of food to the farm. They seized him. They did not ask him gently. They took him to the rack. Under the agony of torture, the boy broke. He whispered the location of the farm. It was late at night when the detachment of cavalry and soldiers set out. They rode with weapons and torches as if they were going after a bandit chief, clattering over the cobblestones, shattering the peace of the countryside. Malachi's spies watched them go and rushed back to the synagogue to report. The trap was sprung at the farm. Polycarp was resting in an upper room. The brethren heard the horses. They heard the shouting. "We can move you," they whispered urgently. "There is another farm over the hill. We can hide you in the cistern." Polycarp looked at them. He was 86 years old. He was tired of running. He was tired of hiding. He remembered the vision of the burning pillow. He remembered the words of the Lord, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. The will of God be done," he said. He refused to leave. He stood up and walked down the stairs to meet the soldiers. The captain of the guard kicked open the door, expecting to find a cowering fugitive or a group of armed zealots. Instead, he found an old man with a white beard and a face that shone with a strange, serene light. Polycarp looked at the soldiers, men who were tired, hungry, and expecting a fight, and he smiled. "Come in, my sons," he said. "You must be hungry from your chase." He ordered the terrified servants of the farm to set a table. He commanded them to bring out bread, cheese, and wine. He served the men who had come to kill him. The soldiers were baffled. They looked at their weapons, then at the food, then at the gentle old man. They ate in awkward silence, ashamed of their mission. Why all this trouble, they wondered, for such a frail old man while they ate? Polycarp asked for one favor. "Give me an hour to pray," he asked. Undisturbed, the captain granted it. Polycarp stood in the corner of the room and began to pray, but he did not pray for an hour. He prayed for 2. He prayed aloud, and the soldiers, listening, heard him name everyone he had ever known, small and great, noble and obscure, and the whole Catholic Church throughout the world. He prayed with such fervency that some of the soldiers began to weep. They regretted that they were the ones chosen to arrest this God-fearing man, but the hour was late, and Herod the police captain was impatient. The time for prayer was over. They put the old man on a donkey and led him back toward the city. The Sabbath had already begun. As they neared the city gates, a carriage met them. It was Herod and his father, Nicetes. They were anxious to end this matter quietly, without a public spectacle if possible. They ordered Polycarp to be transferred into their carriage. They sat on either side of him, trying to play the part of reasonable men. "What harm is there," Nicetes asked, his voice dripping with false concern, "in saying Lord Caesar and offering incense and so saving yourself? It was the temptation of the serpent in the garden, rebranded for the Roman age. It's just a word, Polycarp. It doesn't mean anything. Just say it and live." Polycarp sat silent at first. He looked at these men, men of power, men of the world, and he saw their slavery. They were bound by fear, bound by politics, bound by the lies of the enemy. When they persisted, pressing him, he finally answered, "I am not going to do what you counsel me." The mask of civility dropped instantly. Herod, the man of law, flew into a rage. He cursed the old man. He shoved him violently toward the door of the carriage. Polycarp fell, scraping his shin heavily against the iron step, but he didn't cry out. He stood up, limping slightly, and walked on with the soldiers as if nothing had happened. He was walking toward the stadium. He was walking toward the fire. The noise of the stadium could be heard from miles away. It was a roar like the sea during a storm. The mob had been waiting all day. They were drunk on blood and wine. As Polycarp entered the arena, a voice spoke from heaven. It was not heard by the pagans, whose ears were tuned to the frequency of death, but it was heard by the believers who were present, hidden in the crowd. "Be strong, Polycarp, and play the man." It was the voice of the captain of the host encouraging his soldier for the final battle. Polycarp was brought before the proconsul. The crowd erupted when they saw him, a wave of hatred washing over the sands. The proconsul tried one last time. He looked at the old man's gray hair and felt a pang of conscience. "Swear by the fortune of Caesar," the proconsul urged. "Repent. Say, away with the atheists." Polycarp looked at the crowd. He looked at the faces twisted with hate, the mouths screaming for blood. He looked at the Jewish elders from the synagogue who were leaning over the railings, jeering at him. He saw the synagogue of Satan in its full, terrible manifestation. These were the true atheists, those who had no God but their own pride. Polycarp waved his hand toward the multitude of lawless heathen in the stadium. He looked up to heaven with a deep sigh. Then, looking the proconsul in the eye, he said, "Away with the atheists." He had turned the phrase back on them. The proconsul pressed him harder. "Swear, and I will release you. Revile Christ." The stadium went quiet. This was the moment, the sifting of the wheat. Would the old bishop break? Polycarp stood tall. His voice carried to the highest seats. 86 years have I served him, and he never did me any injury. How then can I blaspheme my king and my savior? The proconsul was angry now. "I have wild beasts," he threatened. "I will throw you to them if you do not repent." "Call them," Polycarp replied. "It is unthinkable for us to repent from what is good to turn to what is evil. But it is good to change from evil to righteousness. If you despise the beasts," the proconsul shouted, his face reddening, "I will have you consumed by fire unless you repent." Polycarp smiled. It was the smile of a man who sees the finish line. "You threaten me with fire which burns for an hour and after a little is extinguished. But you are ignorant of the fire of the coming judgment and of eternal punishment, reserved for the ungodly. But why do you tarry? Bring what you will." The proconsul sent his herald to the center of the stadium to proclaim 3 times, "Polycarp has confessed that he is a Christian." The crowd exploded with fury. "This is the teacher of Asia," they screamed. "The father of the Christians, the destroyer of our gods. Burn him alive." They demanded a lion be let loose, but the Osiarch, the official in charge of the games, refused, saying the beast hunts were over. So the cry went up for fire. And here, the nature of the synagogue of Satan revealed itself most chillingly. The text of the martyrdom records a detail that stands as a permanent indictment. The crowds rushed to the workshops and baths to collect wood and kindling, and the Jews, as was their custom, joined in extremely zealously to assist in this. It was the great Sabbath. Carrying wood was strictly forbidden by the law of Moses. To kindle a fire was a capital offense under the Torah, but their hatred for the truth was greater than their love for the law. They broke the Sabbath to murder a saint. They trampled on the commandments of God to serve the purposes of the devil. Malachi and his followers ran with bundles of wood, their prayer shawls flapping in the wind, throwing the fuel onto the pile that would burn the bishop. In their zeal to destroy the heretic, they destroyed their own claim to righteousness. They proved Jesus right. They were not a synagogue of Yahweh. They were the ministers of the accuser, building a pyre for the righteous on the holy day of rest. The pile was ready. The soldiers moved to nail Polycarp to the stake. "Leave me as I am," Polycarp said gently to the executioner, "for he who grants me to endure the fire will enable me also to remain on the pyre unmoved, without the security you get from the nails." So they did not nail him. They only bound him. He stood there, his hands behind his back, like a noble ram chosen for an oblation from a great flock. He looked up to heaven one last time. The wood was dry. The Jews and the pagans stood back, their faces illuminated by the anticipation of the flames. The 10 days were ending. The crown was descending. "O Lord God Almighty," Polycarp prayed, his voice steady amidst the jeers, "Father of your beloved and blessed Son, Jesus Christ, I bless you that you have counted me worthy of this day and hour." The proconsul gave the signal. The torch was applied. The fire rushed up, a wall of orange and red, hungry for the flesh of the martyr. The heat hit the front rows of the crowd. Malachi watched, his eyes reflecting the flames, waiting for the scream, waiting for the burning of the heresy. But as the fire roared, something inexplicable began to happen. The wind, or perhaps the breath of God, caught the flames. They did not touch the body of the old man. They arched around him, like the sail of a ship filled by the wind, forming a wall around the martyr. He stood in the center, not like burning flesh, but like bread baking in an oven, like gold and silver being refined in a furnace, and there was no smell of burning flesh. Instead, a sweet aroma like frankincense or precious spices wafted over the stadium. The stench of the mob's hatred was overpowered by the fragrance of Christ. The synagogue of Satan had prepared a fire to destroy, but God had turned it into a tabernacle of glory. The liars watched in stunned silence as the fire refused to obey them. Realizing with a creeping dread that they were fighting a power that could not be burned, the stadium was a cauldron of noise and heat. But within the center of the pyre, there was a silence that defied the laws of nature. The flames, which had roared to life with the voracious appetite of a predator, now behaved with the discipline of a soldier. They curled upward, creating a vaulted chamber around the body of the old bishop, a wall of superheated air that refused to touch his flesh. Polycarp stood in the midst of the inferno, his hands bound behind him, his eyes closed in prayer, looking not like a victim being executed, but like a priest standing in the Holy of Holies. The crowd, which seconds before had been baying for ash and bone, now fell into a stunned, murmuring hush. They had come to see a burning. They were witnessing a transfiguration. Malachi, gripping the iron railing of the viewing box, felt a cold sweat break out beneath his heavy woolen robes. This was impossible. The wood was dry, the pitch was fresh, and the wind was favorable. Physics demanded that the man burn. Yet the fire bellied out like a ship's sail in a gale, protecting the very thing it was meant to consume. Even worse was the smell. Malachi inhaled deeply, expecting the sickening, acrid stench of searing meat that usually accompanied Roman justice. Instead, the air was thick with a scent that reminded him of the temple in Jerusalem. The heavy, sweet aroma of frankincense and myrrh, the smell of a pleasing sacrifice ascending to heaven. It was a sensory rebuke from the Almighty. The synagogue of Satan had prepared an altar of destruction, but God had converted it into an altar of incense. The proconsul, Statius Quadratus, leaned forward, his face pale. He was a superstitious man, as were most Romans, and this defied all his experience with executions. "Why does he not burn?" he muttered, his voice trembling slightly. "Is he a sorcerer? Does he command the elements?" He looked at Malachi for an explanation, for some assurance that this was a trick of the Christians, but he found only fear in the old Jew's eyes. Malachi knew this was no trick. He knew, with a sinking dread that settled in the pit of his stomach, that he was watching the same power that had protected the 3 Hebrew children in the furnace of Babylon. He was standing in the shoes of Nebuchadnezzar, forcing a righteous man into the fire, and the 4th man was there, invisible but undeniable. The mob began to shift. The jeers turned to whispers of fear. If the fire would not touch him, perhaps the gods were angry. Perhaps the Christians were right. Panic began to ripple through the stands. Malachi saw the danger instantly. If Polycarp survived the fire, the legend of the Christians would grow tenfold. They would be seen as untouchable, divinely protected. The synagogue's influence would crumble and the people would flock to the atheists. The miracle had to be stopped. The narrative had to be controlled. "He uses magic," Malachi shouted, his voice cracking with desperation, pointing a trembling finger at the figure in the flames. "Do not let the sorcerer mock the justice of Rome. Finish it now." The proconsul, eager to end the unnatural spectacle and restore order, nodded to the executioner, a confecter whose job was usually to dispatch wounded gladiators. The man looked terrified. He held a short, double-edged dagger, but he hesitated to approach the wall of fire that refused to burn. "Go," the proconsul commanded. "End it." The executioner shielded his face with his arm and stepped through the heat. He approached Polycarp, who opened his eyes and looked at the man not with fear, but with a profound pitying sadness. The executioner plunged the dagger into the old man's chest. What happened next became the subject of whispers in Smyrna for generations. As the blade was withdrawn, a torrent of blood gushed forth, an amount that seemed impossible for such a frail, dehydrated body. The blood did not just flow, it sprayed, hitting the base of the fire, and where the blood touched the flames, they hissed and died. The crimson tide acted as a divine extinguisher, quenching the unnatural fire with the life of the martyr. In moments, the roaring pyre was reduced to smoking embers and sodden wood. Polycarp slumped forward, dead, but his body was largely untouched by the fire, washed in his own blood, a final testament to the victory of life over death. The stadium was deathly silent. The spectacle was over, but the feeling of dread hung heavy in the air. The synagogue of Satan had achieved its goal, the bishop was dead, but the victory tasted like ash. Malachi did not wait. He saw the Christians moving toward the arena floor, weeping, ready to claim the body of their father. He scrambled down from the viewing box, intercepting Nicetes, the father of the police captain Herod. "Do not let them take him," Malachi hissed, grabbing the Roman's arm. His eyes were wide, manic. "You know how these people are. If you give them the body, they will abandon their crucified one and begin to worship this man. They will make him a god. It will be a new superstition worse than the first." It was a lie, and Malachi knew it. He knew the Christians worshipped only Christ, but he projected his own idolatrous heart onto them. He could not conceive of honor without worship. He needed to deny them the body because he feared the power of the martyr's memory. He wanted Polycarp erased, turned to dust, blown away by the wind. Nicetes, swayed by Malachi's urgency and his own confusion, nodded. He spoke to the centurion in charge. "Burn it," Nicetes ordered. "Burn it all. Leave nothing but bone." The Christians, led by a grieving deacon, tried to protest. "He is ours," they pleaded. "Let us bury our father." But the centurion, following orders, pushed them back with the shaft of his spear. Fresh wood was brought. The body, now lifeless and unable to resist, was placed back onto the pile. This time, without the spiritual protection of the living saint, the fire did its work. The flesh was consumed. The synagogue of Satan stood by and watched, ensuring that the desecration was complete, unaware that by burning the body they were merely distilling the essence of the testimony. When the fire finally died down, the Christians were allowed to approach. They gathered the bones, more precious than costly stones and more excellent than gold, and wrapped them in fine linen. They carried them away in solemn procession, leaving the stadium empty save for the smell of smoke and the lingering sense of a judgment that had shifted from the victim to the executioners. Malachi walked back to the synagogue as the sun began to set. The streets of Smyrna were quiet, the revelry of the games dampened by the strange events of the afternoon. He walked with his head high, but his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He rubbed his hands together, trying to wipe away the phantom sensation of the heat, but the smell of the incense from the fire seemed to cling to his robes. He entered the synagogue compound, passing the mikveh, the ritual bath. He felt a sudden, desperate need to be clean. He tripped off his expensive robes and plunged into the cold water, scrubbing his skin until it was raw. But the water could not wash the memory of the fire. It could not wash away the blood that had extinguished the flames. He dressed and went to the council chamber. The elders were waiting for him. They looked anxious, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight. They had all seen it. They had all felt it. The victory they had bought with betrayal felt hollow. "It is done," Malachi announced, his voice loud, trying to fill the silence with authority. "The head of the snake is crushed. The heresy will die with him." "Did you see the fire?" one elder whispered. "A man named Simon who dealt in textiles. It did not touch him, Malachi. It embraced him. It was a trick," Malachi snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "A trick of the light, a gust of wind. Do not let superstition cloud your judgment. We have done what was necessary to protect the Torah. We have purified Israel." But the words rang false. The room felt cold. The Torah scroll, sitting in its niche on the wall, seemed to loom over them, a silent judge. Malachi looked at the scroll and looked away. He felt a disconnect, a severance. For years he had convinced himself that he was the defender of God. Now, staring into the shadows of the room, he felt the chilling presence of the entity he had actually been serving. He had become the accuser. He had become the adversary of the righteous. He had led his people not into holiness, but into murder that night. Sleep fled from Malachi. He lay in his bed, listening to the wind rattling the shutters. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Polycarp's face, not screaming in agony, but looking at him with that terrible, serene pity. "I have served him 86 years, the words echoed in Malachi's mind. 86 years of faithfulness. Malachi tried to stack his own years against that. What had he served? Ambition, fear, Rome. He got up and paced the floor. He needed to justify himself. He needed to be right. If he was wrong, then he was damned. He began to rehearse his arguments for the next Sabbath. He would preach on the rebellion of Korah. He would preach on the necessity of order. He would paint Polycarp as a deceiver who used dark arts to fool the simple. He would build a fortress of words to hide the trembling of his soul. Across the city, in the humble house where the believers gathered, the atmosphere was radically different. There was grief, deep and wrenching. They wept for their bishop, for the gentle hands that would no longer bless them, for the voice that would no longer read the scriptures. But beneath the grief there was a steel rod of triumph. The 10 days of tribulation were over. They had passed through the fire, quite literally. They had not denied the name. The synagogue of Satan had thrown everything it had at them: poverty, slander, prison, fire, wild beasts, and the church was still standing. In fact, it was stronger. The death of Polycarp had not scattered them, it had solidified them. They realized now that the power of Rome and the hatred of the religious hypocrites had a limit. They could kill the body, but they could not touch the soul. A young man named Pionius stood up in the gathered assembly. He was not an elder, but the fire of the Spirit was on him. "Brothers and sisters," he said, holding the charred bone fragment they had rescued, "today we celebrate the birthday of Polycarp." They looked at him confused. "Birthday, his birthday into heaven," Pionius declared. "He has finished the race. He has received the crown. The Lord Jesus promised us that if we were faithful unto death, we would receive life. Polycarp is more alive today than he has ever been. We do not mourn as those who have no hope. We rejoice that one of us has conquered." They began to sing. It was a song of defiance against the dark powers. They sang of the victory of the Lamb. They sang of the fire that refines. And as they sang, the fear that had gripped the community during the 10 days evaporated. They knew that the synagogue of Satan had failed. The slander had failed. The accusers were the ones who were defeated. But the spiritual war in Smyrna was not over. It was shifting fronts. The public spectacle was done, but the internal rot within the synagogue was beginning to manifest. The next Sabbath the synagogue was full. The curiosity seekers, the Jews who had been on the fence, the God-fearers, everyone came to hear what Malachi would say. The air was thick with expectation. Malachi ascended the bema. He opened the scroll of Isaiah. He intended to read a passage about judgment on the nations, but as he looked at the Hebrew letters, they seemed to swim before his eyes. He blinked, trying to clear his vision. His throat felt dry, constricted, as if a hand were gripping his windpipe. He tried to speak the ancient blessings, but the words turned to ash in his mouth. He felt a physical heaviness, a spiritual oppression that pressed down on his shoulders. It was the weight of the Satan he had invoked. He had invited the accuser into his sanctuary to destroy the Christians, and now the accuser had taken up residence. The service was a disaster. Malachi stumbled through the liturgy. His sermon was disjointed, angry, filled with venom but devoid of spirit. The people sensed it. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The sweet presence of the God of Israel, the Shekinah that they longed for, was absent. In its place was a cold, bureaucratic emptiness. They left the synagogue feeling drained, not uplifted. Among the congregation was a young scholar named Elias. He was Malachi's protege, a brilliant mind trained in the finest schools of Babylon. He had been zealous for the law, just like his master. He had helped compile the lists of names for the Romans, but Elias had been at the stadium. He had stood near the front. He had seen the look in Germanicus's eyes before the lion struck. He had seen the fire arch around Polycarp. And he had seen the blood. Elias walked out of the synagogue, his heart in turmoil. He could not reconcile what he had seen with what Malachi preached. If God was with the synagogue, why did the fire protect the heretic? If the Christians were atheists, why did they die with the name of God on their lips? He wandered through the city, his feet taking him toward the burned spot in the stadium. It was night now. The arena was empty, a vast bowl of shadows. Elias climbed the fence and walked onto the sand. He smelled the faint lingering odor of the burning. He knelt by the spot where the stake had stood. God of Abraham, he whispered into the darkness, show me where you are. Are you in the marble courts of the synagogue, or are you in the ashes of this pit? A figure stepped out of the shadows. Elias jumped, reaching for the dagger he carried for protection. Peace, the figure said. It was a man, dressed in the simple tunic of a laborer. There is no need for steel here. The ground is holy. Elias squinted. Who are you? I am Demetrius, the man said. The silversmith. Elias knew the name. It was on the list he had helped write. You are one of them, Elias said, his voice trembling. Why are you here? Do you want to die too? I came to pray, Demetrius said, for the men who did this. Elias was stunned. You pray for the Romans. I pray for the Romans, Demetrius said. But mostly I pray for the Jews. I pray for Malachi, and I pray for you, Elias. You know me. I know you, Demetrius said, stepping closer. I saw you at the tribunal. You handed the scroll to the proconsul. You wrote my name. Elias backed away, shame flooding his face. We did what was necessary. You are apostates. You endanger the community. Do we, Demetrius asked softly, or do we fulfill the hope of the community? Elias, you know the scriptures. You know Isaiah chapter 53. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. Did you not see the lamb yesterday? Elias looked at the blackened ground. He wanted to argue, to quote the Talmud, to recite the arguments Malachi had drilled into him, but the words died in his throat. The reality of the witness, the asterisk martyr, was too strong. Why? Elias asked, his voice breaking. Why did the fire not burn him? Because the fire inside him was hotter than the fire around him, Demetrius replied. The love of Christ is a consuming fire. Elias, the synagogue you serve has become a tomb. It preserves the bones of the prophets but kills the spirit of the prophecy. Come out of her. Come to the living water. Elias stood there, torn between two worlds, the safety, the prestige. The heritage of the synagogue lay on one side, on the other lay the shame, the danger, and the undeniable power of the church. I cannot, Elias whispered. Malachi, he is my father in the faith. Malachi serves a master he does not know, Demetrius said sadly. But the master is calling you. The 10 days are over, Elias. The sifting is done. Now comes the harvest. Which side of the scythe will you be on? Demetrius turned and walked away into the shadows. Leaving Elias alone with the ghosts of the arena back in the governor's palace, the proconsul Statius Quadratus was drinking heavily. He could not get the image of the old man out of his head. He had executed hundreds of criminals, rebels, and thieves. He slept soundly after each one. But this one was different. He felt as if he had committed a crime against the cosmos. He summoned his secretary. "Draft a letter to Rome," he slurred. "Tell the emperor. Tell him the Christians in Smyrna are crushed. Tell him order is restored." "And the Jews, sir?" the secretary asked. "The high priest Malachi requests an audience to discuss further measures." "The Jews," the proconsul spat, hurling his goblet across the room. "Keep them away from me. They used me. They turned Roman justice into their personal hit squad. I see them now. They are not loyal to Rome. They are loyal only to their own envy. If Malachi comes here again, tell him I will feed him to the same beasts he demanded for the bishop." The alliance between the synagogue of Satan and the beast of Rome was beginning to fracture. Malachi had thought he could ride the tiger, but the tiger was getting hungry. The spiritual atmosphere over Smyrna was shifting. The heavy, oppressive cloud that had hung over the city during the tribulation was breaking up. The prayers of the martyrs had punched a hole in the darkness. While the church was numerically smaller, stripped of its leaders and its wealth, it possessed a moral authority that terrified the powers of darkness. In the days that followed, a strange phenomenon began to occur. The pagan citizens of Smyrna, who had cheered at the games, began to avoid the synagogue. They whispered that the God of the Jews was a petty, vindictive demon who demanded the blood of harmless old men. Malachi's great plan to secure the reputation of the Jews had backfired spectacularly. Instead of being seen as model citizens, they were seen as malicious informers. The synagogue of Satan label, spoken by Jesus in the spiritual realm, was now becoming a reality in the social realm. They were becoming pariahs, isolated by the very hatred they had sown. Malachi withdrew into his study. The scrolls that had once brought him comfort now seemed to mock him. He read the promises of blessing for Israel, but he felt only the curse. He tried to pray, but the heavens were brass. He realized with a creeping horror that he was alone. The Romans despised him, the Christians pitied him, and God was silent. He sat in the dark, the unlit lamp on his table a symbol of his soul. The accuser had become the accused, and in the silence of his empty house, he heard the faint, distant sound of singing coming from the tanner's district. The Christians were singing. They were singing of resurrection. They were singing of a king who conquered the grave. Malachi covered his ears, but he could not shut out the sound. It was the sound of his own defeat. The synagogue of Satan had done its worst, and it had only succeeded in creating a legend that would outlast the stones of Smyrna. The lie had collided with the truth, and the truth, though bleeding, was still standing. The ashes of the martyr had long since been swept from the stadium floor by the winds coming off the Aegean. But the shadow they cast over the city of Smyrna seemed to lengthen with every passing week. Time, which usually acts as a balm to memory, in this case served only as a magnifying glass, burning the image of the unconsumed bishop into the collective conscience of the metropolis. The victory that Malachi and the council of the synagogue had sought, the eradication of the Nazarene heresy, had transmuted into a slow, grinding defeat. They had struck the shepherd to scatter the sheep, but the sheep had not scattered. Instead, they had gathered closer together, forming an impenetrable phalanx of prayer and charity that no Roman sword could pierce. In the months following the execution of Polycarp, the atmosphere in the synagogue underwent a chilling transformation. The building itself remained magnificent, its white marble columns gleaming in the sun, the menorah polished to a golden shine, the Torah scrolls wrapped in velvet and silver. But the spirit that inhabited the structure had become cold and bureaucratic. The joy of the festivals was replaced by a rigid, defensive formalism. Malachi, once the undisputed lion of the community, now walked the halls like a ghost in his own house. He noticed the empty seats. He noticed the averted eyes of the younger men. He noticed that the Romans, who had once courted his favor to maintain order, now treated him with a disdainful distance. The proconsul Statius Quadratus had sent word that he would receive no more lists of names, no more accusations. The Roman had washed his hands of the Jewish quarrel. Haunted by the memory of the fire that refused to burn, deprived of his political weapon, Malachi found himself fighting a war on a new front, the internal collapse of his own authority. The prophecy of the scroll, "I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not but are a synagogue of Satan," was working its way through the community like a slow poison. It was not that the people read the Christian scriptures, it was that the reality of the accusation manifested in their midst. They had become defined not by what they loved, but by what they hated. Their identity was no longer anchored in the worship of Yahweh, but in the persecution of the church. When a community makes hatred its cornerstone, the foundation inevitably cracks. The crack widened into a chasm in the heart of Elias. The young scholar, who had once been Malachi's most promising disciple, could no longer sleep. The face of Germanicus facing the lion, and the voice of Polycarp in the fire replayed in his mind on an endless loop. He sat in the house of study, surrounded by commentaries and legal codes, but they read like dust. He was looking for life, and he found only geometry, the geometry of a cage. He realized that the synagogue had become a prison of the soul, guarded by the warden of pride. One evening, under the cover of a moonless night, Elias left his quarters near the synagogue and walked toward the poorer district, the maze of tanneries and tenements where the Christians gathered. He did not go to accuse, he went to surrender. He found the house of the new overseer, a man named Pionius, who had taken up the mantle of Polycarp. The door was barred, for the threat of violence still lingered, but Elias knocked. Not the heavy, demanding knock of the soldiers, but the tentative, rhythmic knock of a seeker. When the door opened, Elias found himself staring into the faces of people he had helped to persecute. There was Demetrius the silversmith. There were the widows whose husbands had been imprisoned on his master's orders. By all earthly logic, they should have torn him apart. They should have dragged him before the magistrates or beaten him in the street. But the atmosphere in the room was not one of vengeance. It was one of startling, disarming peace. Elias fell to his knees. It was a physical collapsing of his pride. "I am Elias," he whispered, his voice choking with shame, "son of the covenant, student of Malachi, and I am lost." Pionius did not raise him up immediately. He let the confession hang in the air, recognizing the spiritual weight of the moment. This was the fulfillment of the prophecy given to the church of Philadelphia, echoing now in Smyrna. "I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you." Elias was bowing, not in worship of men, but in recognition of where the true temple now resided. He was acknowledging that the love of God, the Hesed of the covenant, had migrated from the building of stone to this building of living flesh. "Rise, brother," Pionius said gently, extending a hand that was calloused from labor. "The wall of hostility is broken down. If you seek the Messiah, he is here." That night, Elias heard the gospel not as a heresy to be refuted, but as the melody he had been trying to hum all his life without knowing the words. He heard how the suffering servant of Isaiah was the man on the cross. He heard how the glory of the second temple was greater than the first because the incarnate Word had walked within it. He was baptized before dawn, the water of a humble cistern washing away the ash of the stadium. He rose from the water not as a traitor to his people, but as a completed Jew, a son of Abraham who had finally met the ram provided for the sacrifice. The defection of Elias sent a shockwave through the city. When he did not appear at the synagogue for the Sabbath reading, rumors began to swirl. When he was seen walking in the market with Demetrius sharing a loaf of bread, the rumors turned to scandal. Malachi summoned him. He sent servants to drag the young man back, but Elias refused to come by force. Instead, he came voluntarily, standing in the courtyard of the synagogue where he had once studied, facing the man who had been his spiritual father. The confrontation was quiet, terrible, and final. Malachi stood on the steps, trembling with a rage that masked a deep, terrifying grief. "You have joined the atheists," Malachi spat, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You have trampled on the blood of your ancestors. You are dead to us, Elias. We will sit Shiva for you. You are cut off." Elias looked at the old man, and his eyes were filled with tears. He did not see a monster, he saw a tragedy. He saw a man so desperate to preserve the husk of tradition that he had thrown away the kernel of truth. "I am not dead, Father," Elias said softly. "I have just begun to live. The fire you lit in the stadium did not consume the truth. It illuminated it. Malachi, look at your hands. They are stained with the blood of the righteous. You serve the accuser, thinking you serve the Almighty. Come out of the darkness. The Messiah is calling you." "Get out," Malachi screamed, tearing his robe, the ancient sign of mourning and judgment. "May his name be blotted out. Anathema." Elias turned and walked away, passing through the gate of the synagogue for the last time. As he crossed the threshold, he felt the heavy, suffocating mantle of the law lift from his shoulders, replaced by the light yoke of the Nazarene. He left behind a mausoleum and walked into a garden. The decline of the synagogue accelerated. Without the intellectual vigor of men like Elias, and without the political favor of Rome, Malachi's influence waned. The people of Smyrna, pagan though they were, respected courage. They saw the Christians dying with dignity, singing in the face of lions, and then they saw the Jewish leaders skulking in the shadows, whispering slanders to the police. The contrast was too stark to ignore. The synagogue of Satan had overplayed its hand. By allying with the beast to destroy the lamb, they had revealed their true nature. The pagans began to look at the Jews with suspicion, wondering if they too would be betrayed next. Malachi spent his final years in a prison of his own making. He became paranoid, seeing spies in every corner, believing the Christians were plotting a revenge that never came. He did not understand the nature of grace. He expected the sword, but the Christians gave him silence. They prayed for him, as Polycarp had instructed, but they did not engage him. He withered away, a dry branch cut off from the vine, consumed by a bitterness that ate his soul long before death took his body. He died in his sleep, clutching a scroll of the law that he had never truly understood, leaving behind a legacy not of preservation but of persecution. His name was forgotten by the city, but the title Jesus had given his assembly, the synagogue of Satan, remained as a warning scar on the history of the church. Meanwhile, the church in Smyrna, the church of the poor who are rich, entered a golden age of the Spirit. The 10 days of tribulation had acted as a winnowing fan, blowing away the chaff of casual believers and leaving behind a core of solid wheat. They had no money, no political power, and no buildings, but they had the crown of life. The resurrection power that had sustained Polycarp flowed through the community. They fed the poor when the trade guilds failed. They nursed the sick when the plagues returned to the harbor. They became the conscience of the city. Decades turned into centuries. The white marble of Smyrna eventually crumbled. The temple of Cybele fell into ruin, its columns toppled by earthquakes and time. The great altar to Caesar, where men had once pledged their souls for safety, became a curiosity for archaeologists, a broken stone where no incense burned. The Roman Empire itself, the iron beast that had sought to devour the saints, rusted from the inside out and collapsed. But the lampstand of Smyrna remained. The light that Polycarp had tended, the light that Elias had run to, continued to burn. Through the Byzantine era, through the Ottoman conquests, through wars and fires and catastrophes, a remnant of the faithful remained in the city. The prophecy of the crown of life proved to be the only enduring reality in a city of shifting fortunes. The story of the synagogue of Satan serves as the dark negative to the photograph of the church's glory. It remains a terrifying testament to the deceitfulness of religion without relationship. It stands as a monument to the fact that one can hold the correct scriptures, observe the correct holy days, and trace one's lineage back to the patriarchs, and yet be utterly opposed to the heart of God. It teaches that the moment a believer picks up the weapon of accusation, the moment they seek to use the power of the state to crush the conscience of another, they trade the temple of the Holy Spirit for the assembly of the adversary. In the end, the victory belonged to the first and the last. The one who died and came to life had outlasted the persecutors. He had vindicated his saints. The ashes of Polycarp had sown a field that yielded 100-fold, while the fire of Malachi had burned itself out, leaving nothing but cold gray dust. The liars were silenced not by argument, but by the endurance of love. And in the invisible realm, where the true history of the world is recorded, the names of the martyrs were written in gold, while the names of the accusers were blotted out, leaving only the chilling echo of the title they had earned, the synagogue of Satan.